time, no.
Well, anyway, Abu, if you're watching, Jacqui doesn't want you back. Now, the Cabinet discussed plans for airstrikes in Iraq today. Parliament will vote on them tomorrow. No, this isn't a this week repeat from 2003. Britain is once again on the brink of military action in Iraq, just like the good old days, or the bad old days. Take your pick. Speaking of the UN today, the Prime Minister, David Cameron that is, not Tony Blair, said past mistakes must not be an excuse for inaction. But have we learned anything from past mistakes, or will history repeat itself? We turn to anti-war MP George Galloway. This is Take of the Week.
It's Groundhog Day. 11 years ago, here on the streets of Westminster, millions of us marched against the impending US-UK invasion of Iraq. And tomorrow in Parliament, we might just be about to do it all again. Doesn't seem to matter to some that 1 million people lost their lives, that Iraq was ruined, and that the principal beneficiary of the Bush-Blair war on Iraq was Al-Qaeda and people like them. This is not about me supporting ISIS. I'd be happy if every member of ISIS was lying dead here in this street. It's about how we achieve the defeat of ISIS, not whether they need to be defeated. These sectarian, head-chopping, heart-eating maniacs have to be defeated. And the one sure way that you will not achieve it is British and American and French bombers and cruise missiles raining down on yet another Arab Muslim country. Not only can many not see the history of the last 11 years, many in this country appear to have forgotten our history, perfidious Albion in the Arab Middle East over the last century. We need to be strengthening those who are already fighting ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, call them what you will. We need to be strengthening the Kurdish Peshmerga, the governments of Iraq and Syria, and we need to find common ground with Russia, China, and Iran. From Lawrence of Arabia to David Cameron, not much difference really, at least viewed from the Arab street. From their point of view, Britain equals treachery, invasion, and occupation. That's why tomorrow in Parliament, I'll be voting against war in Iraq again.
And from the back streets of Westminster to our own little back street here in the heart of central London, George Galloway joins us. George, welcome to This Week.
Thank you.
George, does it make no difference that this time Iraq has asked for help from the US, its Arab allies and so on? Does that change the equation?
It does make a difference. It makes it legal, where the bombing in Syria right now is illegal. But it doesn't change the other two issues that I raise. It's indiscriminate. You cannot believe anyone who tells you about precision targeting, bombing, weapons and so on. It'll kill a lot of civilians, women, children, and when they're dragged out of the rubble, it will do the third of my triptych. It will be counterproductive. It will strengthen the fanatics and strengthen their appeal across the 1.7 billion Sunni Muslims in the world, including those here.
What do you say to that, Jacqui?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say, George, is that even without us having taken action, it is clear that those within ISIS are already committing barbaric acts. So I don't necessarily believe that, you know, it's a grievance that causes that to happen. It's a Islamist ideology that causes that to happen and which needs to be addressed. The second thing I'd say...
Our barbaric acts, as they'll present them, will replace the barbaric acts that they're carrying out. I think that's George's point.
It is. I disagree with it. But the point I do agree with that George makes is that this needs to be something where those in the region are engaged. Now, they're clearly engaged in the military action. They are asking, in the case of Iraq, for our support with airstrikes. And, George, you know, I've worked with Iraqi parliamentarians. I've worked in Jordan and in other parts of that area. And it strikes me that it is not contradictory to want to both support the development of democratic government and to support with military force where necessary and where asked, in order to defeat something which is putting those fledgling governments at significant risk.
Let me put a point to Michael, then come back to you, George. I mean, we're late to the theatre on this. Our military contribution will be insignificant. The Arab allies are much more important, and we're half-hearted about it. Why are we bothering?
Let me go back to what George said. I mean, I think one must not speak with any jingoism about this, and one must speak with quite a lot of humility, because I think I accept what George says, that we're in the position we're in Iraq, partly because we went to war there in 2003. But I think, although George is right to claim some expertise in the subject, and right to imply, as I think he does, a lack of expertise in London about the Middle East, there is expertise in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Iraq and the UAE and Bahrain, all of whom I think are involved in this operation. And that I do find persuasive. I mean, those countries surely can make the George argument if they care to make the George argument, but they don't. They make an opposite argument. They say that they want our help now. And that is, they do indeed intend to fight this enemy on the ground. They are fighting the enemy on the ground, but they want us to help them to fight it from the air.
Let's, George.
Well, all of those countries you mentioned are, of course, dictatorships to whom freedom and liberty is an alien concept. Secondly, they're not actually...
George.
Sorry?
Jordan isn't a dictatorship.
Jordan is a royal, absolute monarchy dictatorship. I'm sorry, you haven't spent enough time there. The dictatorships that Michael prayed in aid are themselves not speaking for their people. Indeed, much of the support for ISIL comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, much of the money in the beginning. And these countries that you mentioned, several of them, are up to their neck in the blood in the region in the first place. And thirdly, I'm not sure they are involved. I haven't seen any pictures of any Saudi aircraft bombing Syria or Iraq. I haven't seen their livery anywhere. They're on the paper, they're on the masthead, but I don't think they are a significant military part. I don't think they'd even claim to be. But Saudi Arabia has 700 warplanes, 700. We should know, we sold them many. You probably sold them, many of them.
A mixture of tornadoes and typhoons.
Yes. Why can't they do this job?
Well, that's a good question. Why can't they do that?
Turkey is a NATO member with a very powerful army. I mean, Iran has a powerful army.
The point is that if they were really committed, they wouldn't need us. They've got the hardware.
They have got the hardware, but hardware is useless unless you know how to use it. And that's partly about pilot training, and it's partly about...
Well, the Saudi pilots are trained in the UK.
Well, and it's partly about intelligence. Yes, they are. I don't know what their capability is. I'm no longer in any position to assess that. But I don't think anyone would claim that they would have the same expertise that the Americans would have, or probably even at a lower level than the British would have.
I come back to the point I made to Michael. Why are we bothering? I mean, our military contribution is insignificant. We're going to get 6 tornadoes coming out of Cyprus. They don't need us. We're making it more complicated by saying we'll do Iraq, but we won't do Syria. There is some symbolism for the Americans, but the French are there already. Why do we need to be there?
I hope we're bothering for both a principled and a pragmatic reason. The principled reason being, I'm an internationalist. I believe that when people call for your assistance in fighting the barbarism that we're seeing at the moment from ISIL, you should come to their assistance to help them. Pragmatically, I think there is some evidence that those who have been radicalised and, in fact, who have carried out hideous acts in Iraq and Syria, were they to return to the UK or were they to want to plot against the UK, would be a threat to our national interests.
If we're bombing them...
Are they less likely to do so if
we're
we
bombing them?
Bomb them? These people were encouraged to go and fight in Syria by Western policy right at the beginning of this conflict. It was an insane policy, as I tried to point out at the time, because all these people would be all dressed up with nowhere to go except back home with all the skills, terrorist skills that they acquired in that conflict. The problem for both Michael and Jacqui is that the public have heard all this before. These were the reasons we were told we should invade and occupy Iraq in the first place, and it didn't work then. Why should we believe that it will work now? Terrorism flourished, cascaded everywhere in the world as a result of the first Iraq war, the second one as it happened. Dame Eliza Manningham Buller warned us in advance of the war that that would be the case.
She was the head of MI5.
She was the head of MI5, and she said the risk of terrorism here in Britain will be greater, George, if we invade and attack Iraq.
We are not to blame for violent Islamism. 9/11 happened before, for example, we went into Afghanistan. I think to try and sort of somehow suggest, you know, I was glad to see your condemnation in the film, but what you now appear to be trying to do is to be shifting responsibility for barbarism that is the responsibility of ISIL somehow onto us. This isn't actually about us. This is about their responsibility.
George leaves out any sense of urgency. I mean, ISIL has made tremendous advances, taken over much of Syria and much of Iraq. The Iraqi government, to say the least of it, is alarmed about that. The other powers in the region are, to say the least of it, alarmed about that. This isn't just about considering whether a bit of bombing is going to make them more likely to attack us or is going to make them more militant. It is also about trying to arrest what has been until recently a deteriorating military situation.
Well, let me pick up on that, because there's a report in yesterday's New York Times, a very authoritative report that pointed out that after 6 weeks of American air raids in Iraq, not in Syria, but in Iraq, ISIL, or ISIS, or whatever you want to call it, hasn't given up a single bit of ground. They're still there. Indeed, yesterday they took over an Iraqi army camp 30 miles from Baghdad. So what is air power going to do?
Well, air power obviously can kill a lot of people and destroy a lot of equipment and can destroy command centres. It does need to be accompanied by an operation on the ground. And I think George is absolutely right to say the operation on the ground ought to be one that's conducted by the local powers.
One thing I'm sure of, the Saudis and the UAE are not going to commit troops.
No, they're not. They simply are not, and they want us to do it for them, even though they are in part responsible for this problem. But I'm, Jacqui, in no doubt at all about your responsibility in this. And 2 million of us on the streets of London told you so at the time. And for you now to try and wash your hands of your share of the responsibility, I'm afraid that's a spot that will not out. All the perfumes of Arabia will not expunge that spot.
And all of your poetry, George, doesn't prevent people from being murdered and massacred in Iraq and Syria at the moment. I'm not washing my hands of what happened in the past.
You killed a million people in Iraq.
That is a separate...
You killed 1 million people in Iraq. It's incredible that you have the brass neck to be sitting here now urging another Iraq war after what you've already done. George, if I was still in Parliament, I would be there tomorrow, living up to my responsibility to answer the call of the Iraqi government and people to help to support them. And the fact that you aren't is something that you will have to live with.
Let me ask a final question to you, George. If not bombing, if not intervention, how do we deal with this cancer?
Give Iraq the weapons that it's already paid for but haven't been delivered. Strengthen the Peshmerga. Strengthen the governments of Iraq and Syria, and ask Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Iran to fight this battle. It's their battle, not ours.
Okay, George Galloway, thanks for being with us. Now it's late. Alex Salmond's dream of an independent Scotland late. But don't activate the Babe Station subscription just yet, because waiting in the wings...